Andrew Test Martin. Test was a Canadian professional wrestler who worked for the WWE on two separate occasions, once from 1998 till 2004, and then again from 2006 to 2007. Test made his debut in October of 1998, where he was playing a bodyguard for the band Motley Crue, who was performing that night. In a scripted encounter during the rehearsal for Motley Crue, Test would throw a rowdy fan off of the stage in an attempt to show his strength. Eventually, Test would align himself with the Corporation stable, which consisted of mostly the McMahons, The Rock, the Big Boss Man, and Ken Shamrock, as well as others. Test is probably best known for the storyline in which he was dating Stephanie McMahon. However, the outcome of this storyline would make Test look pretty silly in the end. Test would end up wrestling Shane McMahon at SummerSlam 1999 to get the blessing to marry Stephanie McMahon. However, on the episode of Raw where they were meant to get married, Test and Stephanie would both find out that Triple H had drugged Stephanie McMahon and taken her through a drive-thru chapel to get them married. Test would end up having a match with Triple H after this revelation. However, in a baffling move, WWE decided to have Triple H win this feud. It's not like losing to Test was gonna hurt Triple H's momentum that bad. In my personal opinion, they did Test really dirty here. Eventually, after a brief run with the Hardcore Championship, Test would turn heel and align himself with Trish Stratus and Albert in a faction called TNA. TNA's most notable feud was probably when they had their matches against the APA, and after taking the APA out of action, took over their office and changed their name to TNAPA. By late 2000, TNA disbanded after Stephanie McMahon ordered Albert to attack Test on her behalf. This turned Test face in the process. In January of 2001, Test would win the European Championship from William Regal after eliminating him from the Royal Rumble the night before. Test would end up losing the European Championship at WrestleMania to Eddie Guerrero after assistance from the Radicals. Test would end up being a turncoat during the Invasion storyline and aligned himself with WCW and ECW. During this time, Test and Booker T would defeat the Brothers of Destruction to win the WCW Tag Team Championships. After losing the WCW Tag Team titles to the Hardy Boys, they would eventually win the WWF World Tag Team Championships later that year. During his time as a World Tag Team Champion, Test also defeated Edge to win the Intercontinental Championship, making him a double champion. At Survivor Series 2001, the pay-per-view that would end the Invasion storyline, Test lost his Intercontinental Championship to Edge in a title unification match. Later that night, Test would attack Scotty 2 Hotty and take his place in the Immunity Battle Royal. The Immunity Battle Royal was essentially just a battle royal with a bunch of guys from the WWF side and the Alliance side fighting for their job security. Test ended up winning the Immunity Battle Royal, meaning that he could not be fired if the Alliance lost the Survivor Series tag match in the main event, which they did. In early 2002, Test was drafted to the SmackDown brand during the first draft. Test would eventually have a hellacious match with Brock Lesnar during the King of the Ring tournament. However, Lesnar would defeat Test. Later on in 2002, Test, alongside Lance Storm, Christian, and William Regal, would start a faction called the Un-Americans. Believe it or not, none of the members of the Un-Americans were American. At SummerSlam 2002, Test would get destroyed by The Undertaker in a match that lasted seconds. By September of 2002, the Un-Americans split up and began fighting one another on an episode of Raw. Test would change up his look by 2003 after his real-life girlfriend Stacy Keibler became his new image consultant. During this time, for some reason, Test began calling his fans his testicles. Yeah, real clever stuff we got going on here. Test would eventually turn heel once again after he began mistreating Stacy Keibler and would say some just god-awful things to her on television. Test would have a brief tag team run with Scott Steiner, however, it would eventually come to an end. At the 2004 Royal Rumble, Test was supposed to enter the Royal Rumble match, however, it was shown that he was attacked backstage by Mick Foley. The next night on Raw, Test would attack Foley and get his revenge. Test would only work house shows for the rest of 2004 before he would eventually hurt his neck. After being injured for about 4 months, Test, alongside A-Train and Billy Gunn, were released by WWE. Test would work the independent circuit from 2004 until his return to WWE in 2006. Test would return to WWE in the summer of 2006 as a part of the relaunched ECW brand. Test mostly aligned himself with his real-life girlfriend Kelly Kelly and her kayfabe boyfriend Mike Knox while on ECW. Test would have some pretty notable feuds against Sabu and Bobby Lashley before eventually being released by WWE again in 2007. Test would join TNA Wrestling in 2007 and have a very, very brief run as the Punisher Andrew Martin before being released by TNA because apparently they thought they were going to be investigated because of the Benoit stuff and didn't want someone as, well, on steroids as Test was. TNA was not in any trouble there. I think they just wanted to get rid of Test. Let's be real here. That's as messed up as that sounds. I think they just wanted to get him off their roster because he's probably had a really lucrative contract. Test retired from wrestling by 2008 and became a personal trainer. Tragically, Test would not get to enjoy this new life of his for much longer. In 2009, a neighbor living in an apartment adjacent from Test noticed that he had been laying motionless on his couch for a few days and called 911. On March 13, 2009, Andrew Martin was pronounced dead by police who found him in his home laying motionless on his couch with a half-eaten meal. The death of Andrew Martin was labeled as an accidental overdose. Test was only 33 years old when he died. Test's brain was found to have had severe CTE after it was examined after his death. The death of Test was largely ignored by the WWE, who didn't even bother to give him an in memoriam graphic at the beginning of a show. Test, quite frankly, could have been a major star in the WWE had he been given the opportunity. But another unfortunate truth was that Test couldn't really cut a promo, and he just didn't have a lot of charisma when he was in the ring. All things considered, Test was a tremendous performer who entertained millions week after week, and it is unfortunate that he is no longer with us today. The slaying of Chris Adams. Since the life and career of Gentleman Chris Adams was already covered on Dark Side of the Ring, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the darker side of Chris Adams for this video. Not really his career. If you would like to know more about his career, I recommend watching Dark Side of the Ring. Besides his trouble with the law, Chris Adams is most famous for 3 things: his stint with WCW, inventing the super kick, and being the one who trained Stone Cold Steve Austin. It has been said by many people that Chris Adams could have been one of the best wrestlers in the world had he not had so many issues with drugs and alcohol. Unfortunately, Adams was also no stranger to being arrested. On a flight home from Puerto Rico in 1986, Chris Adams headbutted a pilot 3 times and attacked a male flight attendant. Adams apparently had to be restrained by several other wrestlers, including Kevin Von Erich. You're probably wondering what caused Chris Adams to have this meltdown. Well, the short answer is they stopped selling liquor on the plane. Adams was fined $500 and had to spend 90 days in jail after this incident. Adams would get arrested again in 1988 after his wife at the time, Tony Adams, was found severely beaten by police after Adams had gone on a drunken rampage and attacked his then wife. Then, in 1991, Adams would be arrested a few more times for DUI charges and end up on probation. Another incident involving Chris Adams happened in April of 2000 when he and his girlfriend at the time, Linda Kafangst, were both found unconscious in a friend's apartment. Adams and Kafangst had both overdosed on a mixture of GHB and alcohol. Chris Adams would recover from this about 10 hours later. Unfortunately, though, Linda Kafangst would die as a result of the overdose. Adams was indicted for manslaughter due to the incident in June of 2001. However, Chris Adams would never make it to trial. On October 7, 2001, Chris Adams was drinking at his friend William Boo Ray Parnell's house. Adams, in a fit of drunken rage, began attacking Boo Ray, and Boo Ray began fearing for his life as Adams was starting to beat him more and more. Eventually, Boo Ray, fearing for his life, took out a .38 caliber handgun and fatally shot Chris Adams. Boo Ray was acquitted of any murder charges when the court found that he acted in self-defense. Chris Adams was 46 when he died. Unfortunately for Chris Adams, his memory has pretty much been tainted by the way he went out. Nowadays, Chris Adams isn't remembered as the guy who won 26 championships across promotions like the UWF, World Class Championship Wrestling, and World of Sport. He's not remembered as being pretty good at judo, or training Steve Austin, or inventing the super kick. He's remembered as the wrestler whose drunken rage got him shot to death by a friend. The Bill DeMott allegations. Bill DeMott is a wrestler who rose to prominence in the mid-90s as Hugh Morris in WCW. As Hugh Morris, for most of his tenure, he was just an enhancement talent. However, towards the dying days of WCW, Morris would end up getting a push and actually won the WCW United States Championship. Morris would also be added to a faction known as the Misfits in Action, which had him named General Rection, which was an abbreviation for Hugh G. Rection. Yeah, great stuff. Anyway, after WCW ended, DeMott's contract was picked up by the WWF and he would begin wrestling as a member of the Alliance as Hugh Morris. After the invasion angle, Morris would start using his real name, Bill DeMott, as he wrestled on SmackDown in 2002. The peak of DeMott's time in WWE was probably when he entered the 2003 Royal Rumble match, however, he ended up being eliminated. Eventually, DeMott stopped wrestling full-time and WWE assigned him to be a trainer at their developmental territories, including Deep South Wrestling, FCW, and of course, NXT, as well as the WWE Performance Center. DeMott was also a trainer on the WWE reality show Tough Enough, where a bunch of non-trained performers would try to win a WWE contract. DeMott's time as a trainer with WWE would come to an end in 2015 after he resigned due to tons of allegations of misconduct being brought up against him. I will only be talking about some of the more notable allegations, however, I implore you to read all about these other allegations as well. There is a lot of claims against DeMott. Kevin Matthews was one of the first wrestlers to allege that Bill DeMott had been using inappropriate conduct while training wrestlers. He alleges that Zack Ryder and Melissa Coates were forced to perform naked stink faces on each other, which of course is a move popularized by Rikishi, where you put your butt in your opponent's face. He also alleges that he forced Drew Hankinson, who you probably know better as Festus or Luke Gallows, to train naked. Devin Nicholson, who you may know better as wrestling YouTuber Hannibal, also claims to have witnessed the stink face incident and claims that it was the reason that he left the promotion. His video discussing this, however, has since been deleted. Austin Madelson, who is better known as AEW star Killswitch, also wrote a letter to HR about some of the disturbing allegations against DeMott, including racism, homophobia, and telling students to end their lives after they had just paid tribute to a wrestler by the name of Mike Graham, who had recently taken his own life. According to Matelson, Talent Relations ended up telling DeMott about him writing this letter, and DeMott openly mocked him for it. This was after Talent Relations had promised Austin that they would keep the letter confidential. Ryan Nemeth from TNA alleges that he brought to DeMott's attention that the strength and conditioning coach had been harassing female trainees. However, DeMott did nothing. Nemeth described DeMott as an enabler and a protector. Brian Myers, also known as Kurt Hawkins, also alleges that letters were being wrote to management all the time about Bill DeMott's behavior. According to Myers, DeMott would even tear the notes out of wrestlers' hands and then post them on the bulletin board. Mike Bucci, who is better known as Simon Dean or Nova from ECW, has also called DeMott a bully who was intentionally stiff with people in the ring. AEW star Kenny Omega has also alleged that DeMott played favorites with people who would go out and drink with him and have barbecues with him, and that whenever WWE would ask who they should call up, DeMott would always suggest them. Wrestler Ivelisse Velez, who wrestled as Sofia Cortez in NXT, alleges that she lost everything after she spoke up against Bill DeMott. Bob Hardcore Holly, who also has a lot of bullying allegations against him, has also said that he heard from 2 NXT trainees that DeMott was doing all of these things. In closing, since these are just allegations, all I really have to say is, I never liked Bill DeMott as a wrestler. Rockin' Rebel does the unthinkable. Chuck Williams, better known by his ring name Rockin' Rebel, was a wrestler from the territory days of the 90s who ended up in ECW and is considered by some to be an ECW original. Williams would be a lower card heel for ECW, and he would also end up working for XPW after ECW closed. However, Rockin' Rebel's legacy is not that of his wrestling career. It is more or less just the thing that he did before his untimely death. To preface the fact that I am not going to be talking very nicely about this man, it should be known that Rockin' Rebel was not liked by his peers either. Former ECW showrunner Todd Gordon has stated that Rockin' Rebel used to walk around the locker room bitching about the fact that he was the only Eastern Championship Wrestling guy who hadn't won a belt since the switch to Extreme. X-Pac has also stated that Rockin' Rebel was really shitty to other wrestlers despite being nice to him. Oh, and that's not all. Rockin' Rebel also has a history of abusing his wife. Sometime in the 90s, Chuck Williams was arrested for taking his wife Stephanie hostage in a closet. He had apparently held a gun to her head and was threatening to harm himself and her. Unfortunately for Stephanie, she would end up staying with Chuck Williams, and it would cost her her life. In the early hours of June 1st, 2018, Chuck Williams shot his wife Stephanie to death, and then ended his own life with the same gun. While that is disturbing enough, the most disturbing part in my eyes is that his 2 10-year-old children were the ones that discovered the bodies. A lot of similarities and comparisons can be drawn to Chris Benoit and Rockin' Rebel. However, there is one thing that I can say Benoit has that Williams didn't. At least some people had nice things to say about Chris Benoit. In closing, Rockin' Rebel was a monster. He took the lives of his wife and made his children witness the horrors that he had done. In closing, the simple thing I have to say is that Stephanie Williams should be here today, but she isn't because of the horrible actions of Rockin' Rebel. It is a travesty that she won't be able to get the justice that she deserves. The struggles of Rosie. Matthew Onawai, who is probably better known for his ring name Rosie, worked for the WWE from 2002 until 2006. Rosie stuck out among the roster of the WWE due to how big he was and how quickly he moved for someone his size. Rosie initially started his WWE run in developmental alongside his cousin Jamal, who is probably better known as Umaga. Rosie and Jamal would debut in late 2002 as henchmen for Eric Bischoff under the name 3 Minute Warning. Eventually, 3 Minute Warning would gain Rico as a manager after Rico betrayed Billy and Chuck. Rosie and Jamal would then go on to absolutely demolish Billy and Chuck in a match on pay-per-view. 3 Minute Warning never did manage to win any tag team titles, and in June of 2003, Jamal was released by WWE, leaving Rosie on his own. After a brief stint working with Teddy Long, Rosie would begin teaming up with the Hurricane. The Hurricane was insanely over during 2003 after his program with The Rock, which also made Rosie pretty popular in the process. Rosie would become a superhero in training and would even wear the initials SHIT on his clothes for a while. Along with this shirt, Rosie would comically wear a hurricane beach towel around his neck as his cape. Rosie and Hurricane were involved in a lot of comedic segments, including one where they chased little people around with a net backstage, and one where The Rock called them Hamburglar and Grimace. After teaming together for 2 years, Super Stacy would end up joining the crew as their valet. Rosie and Hurricane would finally win the World Tag Team Championships at Backlash 2005. However, later that year, after they lost the tag team titles, Hurricane would turn on Rosie and in the process became the new heel character, Gregory Helms. After losing a match to Gregory Helms, Rosie wouldn't do a whole lot until eventually in March of 2006, he decided to not renew his WWE contract. After leaving WWE, Rosie would work for All Japan Pro Wrestling for about a year before he would eventually go back to the independent circuit. As for the struggles I mentioned, Rosie struggled with obesity for most of his career. In March of 2007, Rosie would attempt to compete on an ABC reality series called Fat March. The show was basically a competition where 12 contestants who were overweight would try to walk 570 miles to lose weight. There was also a prize pool of $1.2 million involved as well. Rosie's reasoning for participating on the show wasn't just to lose weight, but it was also because he felt like it was no longer safe for him to compete in the ring. Rosie would unfortunately have to leave the show during the 5th episode after he hurt his knee. While Rosie continued to struggle with his weight, he still managed to have other business ventures outside of wrestling and continued to wrestle at the same time. Rosie and his father Sika at one point ran their own wrestling promotion called Epic Championship Wrestling in Florida. He also had his own restaurant at one point called Island Boy Barbecue located in Cincinnati. Rosie at some point had also taken a hiatus from wrestling to spend more time with his children. In 2016, Rosie wrestled his last match when he teamed up with the Hurricane and Vinny Pacifico against Chris Benny, Jay George, and Steve Scott. Sadly, on April 17, 2017, Matthew Anawai passed away from congestive heart failure. He was only 47 years old. While Rosie never reached the same level of success that his brother Roman Reigns did, he still did a lot in the business. He was entertaining, he was funny, and according to the Hurricane, he was a pretty damn good guy. And in all honesty, that's what matters most in life. The last match of Mitsuharu Masawa. Mitsuharu Masawa is often considered to be one of the greatest pro wrestlers to ever come out of Japan. Masawa, along with Kenta Kobashi, Akira Taue, and Toshiaki Kawada, were a group known as the Four Pillars of Heaven in All Japan Pro Wrestling. Mitsuharu Masawa is also the founder of Pro Wrestling Noah, another Japanese wrestling promotion that took off in the 2000s. Another fact about the legendary Mitsuharu Masawa is that he was the second man to don the Tiger Mask moniker, and he was known as Tiger Mask 2. Masawa worked an intense style that took a toll on his body, and as he was getting older, he wanted to retire. Masawa had planned on retiring in 2007. However, his big star, Kenta Kobashi, was injured, and Masawa, knowing that Pro Wrestling Noah wasn't in great shape at the time, needed to stick it out and be world champion until Kobashi could come back. While Mitsuharu Masawa was considered one of the greatest pro wrestlers in all of Japan in his prime, Masawa by 2008 was worn down, beaten up, out of shape, and it didn't help that he was an avid chain smoker. It also didn't help that Masawa was battling a nagging neck injury that caused him pain non-stop in doing basic things. Masawa still did his best every night to entertain the fans the best that he could up until 2009. On June 13th, 2009, the Emerald Warrior would walk down the ramp one last time. That night, Masawa was teaming up with Go Shiozaki against Akitoshi Saito and Bison Smith for the GHC Tag Team Championships. During the match, Saito hit Masawa with a belly-to-back suplex, and after he hit the mat, he never got back up. As the fans had chanted his name so many times before to get him up off the mat, this time, it just didn't work. After several CPR attempts and attempting to resuscitate him with an AED, Masawa was rushed to Hiroshima University, where he was pronounced dead at 10:10 p.m. Masawa's family had asked that the police keep his cause of death secret. However, it's speculated that he died from a cervical spinal cord injury, causing him to go into cardiac arrest. The death of Masawa sent shockwaves through the entire pro wrestling industry. Whether it be through his matches, his company, Pro Wrestling Noah, or his legacy as Tiger Mask 2, Mitsuharu Masawa left an indelible mark on pro wrestling and will never be forgotten.